The earthquake hit at 2:17 p.m. during the school field trip. When the dust settled, the cave mouth was completely blocked, 5 children trapped inside with their elderly volunteer guide. "He's just a retiree," the emergency chief said. "We can't rely on him." But they didn't know who they were talking about. 72 hours later, the whole town would learn the true meaning of "never leave a man behind." The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge State Park as the yellow school bus pulled into the gravel parking lot. It was Tuesday, October 15th, and Lincoln Elementary's 5th-grade class was buzzing with excitement about their geology field trip to Crystal Cave. 23 students, 2 teachers, and 1 volunteer guide stepped off the bus into the crisp autumn air. The volunteer guide was Frank Martinez, 68 years old, wearing a worn flannel shirt and sturdy hiking boots that had seen better days. His gray hair was neatly combed under a faded baseball cap with a small American flag pin, and his weathered hands held a clipboard with practiced ease. Most parents knew him as the quiet widower who lived on Pine Street, the one who always helped neighbors with their groceries, shoveled snow from their driveways, and never asked for anything in return. What they didn't know was that Master Sergeant Francisco Frank Martinez had spent 3 tours in Vietnam, 2 in Afghanistan, and had earned a Silver Star for valor under fire when he single-handedly held off enemy forces for 6 hours to protect wounded Marines. But Frank never talked about that. The medals stayed locked in a drawer, the nightmares stayed buried, and the skills stayed dormant. Today, he was just Mr. Martinez, the man who'd volunteered to help because the school needed an extra adult, and he had nothing but time since his wife Maria passed 2 years ago. "All right, kids," Frank called out, his voice gentle but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Crystal Cave is beautiful, but we follow the rules. Stay with the group, no running, and always listen for my voice. In caves, my voice is your lifeline." Emma Rodriguez, 11 years old, with bright brown eyes and her mother's stubborn streak, raised her hand eagerly. "Mr. Martinez, how deep does the cave go? My dad says caves can go on forever underground." Frank smiled, the kind of patient smile he'd perfected with his own grandchildren before they moved across the country. "About 200 feet into the mountain, Emma. We'll see limestone formations that took millions of years to create. Each drop of water that fell carried minerals that built these chambers one tiny piece at a time." The group of 5 students who'd stay closest to Frank included Emma, along with Marcus Thompson, a quiet 11-year-old who read everything he could about geology and carried a worn notebook everywhere. Sarah Chen, 10, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan and who spoke 3 languages but was shy about speaking up in groups. Tyler Jackson, the class athlete who'd rather be playing football but was secretly fascinated by the cave formations. And little Sofia Gonzalez, who at 10 was the smallest but most curious of the bunch, always asking why and how about everything she encountered. These 5 had specifically requested to be in Frank's group after meeting him at the parent information session. Something about his calm presence and the way he actually listened when children spoke had drawn them to him. The cave entrance was a natural archway carved into the limestone cliff, about 15 feet wide and 12 feet high. Cool air flowed from the darkness within, carrying the earthy scent of underground streams and ancient rock. Stalactites hung like frozen waterfalls from the entrance ceiling, and the worn path showed evidence of thousands of visitors over the years. Frank led his group inside, their flashlights cutting through the shadows that seemed to breathe with the movement of air currents. The main passage was wide and well-maintained, with safety railings and emergency call boxes every 100 feet, standard equipment that gave parents peace of mind and children confidence to explore. "Look at these formations," Frank explained, pointing to delicate stalactites hanging from the ceiling like nature's chandeliers. Each drop of water that formed these carried tiny minerals. It takes 100 years to grow just 1 inch. Some of these formations are older than human civilization. The children were mesmerized. Marcus ran his fingers along the smooth stone walls, noting the different rock layers in his notebook. Sarah took photos with her phone, trying to capture the way the flashlight beams created dancing shadows on the cave walls. Sophia gasped at every new chamber they entered, her small voice echoing in the vast spaces. Tyler, despite his initial reluctance, found himself asking technical questions about how the passages were formed. And Emma, ever the curious one, wanted to know if people lived in caves like this thousands of years ago. Frank answered every question with patience and detail, drawing on knowledge he'd accumulated not just from the Park Service materials, but from his own experience with cave systems in Southeast Asia during his military service, experience he'd never shared with anyone, not even Maria. They were about 150 feet into the cave, in a chamber the park called the Cathedral Room for its soaring ceiling and natural acoustic properties. When Frank's military instincts kicked in, something felt wrong. The air pressure had changed subtly, the quality of sound was different, and there was a vibration in the stone that his trained senses recognized as danger. "Kids," he said quietly, his voice carrying new urgency, "I need everyone to stop moving and listen to me very carefully." But before he could explain, the earth began to shake. At first, it was just a rumble, like distant thunder or a heavy truck passing overhead. Frank's body went into automatic response mode, 3 decades of military training flooding back in an instant. His eyes scanned for cover, exit routes, potential threats. His mind calculated risks and response options in fractions of seconds. "Everyone down!" Frank shouted, throwing himself over little Sophia as a piece of rock the size of a basketball crashed where she'd been standing just moments before. His arthritic knees screamed in protest, but muscle memory overrode the pain. The earthquake lasted only 45 seconds, but each second felt like an eternity. The cathedral room, which had stood unchanged for millennia, transformed into a chaos of falling rock, choking dust, and terrifying sound. Limestone chunks weighing hundreds of pounds crashed down from the ceiling, the safety railings twisted and bent under the impact of falling debris. Emergency call boxes sparked and went dark as their connections were severed. When the shaking finally stopped, Frank could hear nothing but settling debris, the ominous creak of fractured stone still finding its balance, and the frightened breathing of 5 children huddled around him in the darkness. He clicked his flashlight with hands that he refused to let tremble. The beam revealed their worst nightmare. The passage they'd entered through was completely gone, sealed by tons of fallen rock that reached from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with limestone dust that made them all cough, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the ominous trickle of water where there had been none before, a sign that the earthquake had disrupted underground streams and potentially compromised the cave's stability even further. "Mr. Martinez," Emma's voice was small and scared, barely above a whisper. "Are we trapped?" Frank looked at the 5 young faces staring at him in the flashlight beam. Terror filled their eyes, the kind of raw primal fear that comes when children first realize that adults might not be able to fix everything. But they looked to him for answers, for hope, for the kind of strength that only adults are supposed to have. In that moment, every instinct he'd learned in 3 decades of military service, every leadership principle he'd mastered under fire, every promise he'd ever made to never leave a man behind, awakened with crystal clarity. "No," he said firmly, his voice carrying the absolute conviction of someone who had faced impossible odds before and lived to tell about it. "We're not trapped. We're just taking a longer route home." Outside, chaos erupted across 3 counties as the 5.7 earthquake made its presence known. Emergency vehicles screamed toward Cedar Ridge State Park from every direction, their sirens creating a symphony of urgency that could be heard for miles. Parents who had been shopping, working, or going about their Tuesday routines suddenly found themselves racing toward the park in panic after receiving frantic calls from school officials. Principal Janet Myers stood before the massive pile of rubble that had once been the cave entrance, her face drained of color and her hands shaking as she held her radio. The entrance that had welcomed thousands of visitors over the years was now nothing more than a chaotic pile of limestone blocks, some weighing several tons, stacked haphazardly and still settling with occasional small avalanches. 5 children and Mr. Martinez are inside, she told Emergency Coordinator Robert Hayes, her voice breaking with each word. The Martinez group, They were scheduled to be in the deepest section when this happened. They would have been in the cathedral room, maybe even further back. Emergency Chief Robert Hayes, a man who'd spent 25 years dealing with every kind of disaster from forest fires to flash floods, surveyed the rock fall through high-powered binoculars. His experienced eye told him this was far worse than a typical cave-in. The pile was at least 30 feet deep, composed of limestone blocks that had fallen with tremendous force, creating an interlocked mass that would be incredibly dangerous to disturb. "We need specialized equipment," he radioed to the State Emergency Management Office, his voice grim with the weight of professional experience. "Heavy machinery, structural engineers, cave rescue specialists. This is going to take days to clear safely, and one wrong move could trigger another collapse." Parent Lisa Rodriguez, Emma's mother, grabbed Chief Hayes' arm with desperate strength. Her eyes were red with tears she was trying not to shed in front of the other parents. "My Emma is in there? Can't you hear them? Can't you do something now?" Hayes shook his head, his own frustration evident in the tightness around his eyes. "Ma'am, I need you to understand. That's not just rocks. It's an unstable collapse zone. The earthquake may have compromised the entire cave system. One wrong move with heavy equipment could cause another cave-in that would crush anyone still alive inside. We have to wait for the specialized teams from the state capitol." "What about Mr. Martinez?" asked Maria Gonzalez, Sophia's mother, clutching her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. "He's just a retiree who volunteers at the school. How can he possibly keep them safe in there? He doesn't have training for this kind of thing." Chief Hayes had the same question gnawing at his gut. In his emergency handbook, situations like this required teams of trained professionals, specialized rescue equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, and carefully coordinated operations that took days to plan and execute. An elderly civilian, no matter how well-meaning, couldn't possibly have the expertise, equipment, or physical capability to handle the responsibility of keeping 5 children alive in a collapsed cave system with potential flooding, unstable air supply, and unknown structural dangers. But Chief Hayes didn't know Frank Martinez's real story. He didn't know about the Silver Star citation that read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy." He didn't know about the night in 1969 when then Sergeant Martinez had held an isolated firebase against overwhelming odds for 6 hours, coordinating defensive fires while wounded until reinforcements could arrive. He didn't know about the cave systems in Laos, where Frank had spent weeks at a time, moving through underground networks that made Crystal Cave look like a beginner's training course. Inside the cave, Frank was already conducting what military personnel call a hasty situation assessment. His phone showed no signal bars. The rock fall had likely severed any cellular relay equipment in the cave. The children's phones were either dead from the impact or similarly without signal. Their supplies were limited but not hopeless. 3 water bottles had survived intact from the group's day packs, along with some granola bars, fruit snacks, and sandwiches that had been packed for their lunch outside. More importantly, Frank was conducting a detailed assessment of his 5 young charges. Marcus had a scrape across his forehead where a small rock had grazed him, but his pupils were equal and reactive, no signs of concussion. Emma was shaken and fighting back tears, but physically uninjured. Sarah was trying hard not to cry, her small frame trembling with suppressed fear. Tyler was putting on a brave face with the kind of forced bravado that 11-year-old boys use to hide terror. And Sophia was the smallest, the most vulnerable, and she was looking at Frank with the absolute trust that only children can give, as if he could perform miracles simply because he was the adult in charge. "Okay, team," Frank said, gathering them in a circle on a relatively clear patch of cave floor. "First thing we do in any emergency is assess our situation honestly and count our advantages. Everyone check yourselves carefully. Are you hurt anywhere? Even small cuts or bruises. We need to know everything." They went through each child systematically, Frank using techniques he'd learned in military first aid to check for signs of injury they might not be aware of due to shock and adrenaline. Minor scrapes and bruises, but thankfully no serious trauma. Frank's own arthritis was screaming from the jarring impact when he'd thrown himself over Sophia, and he could feel a sharp pain in his ribs where a falling rock had clipped him, but he kept those details to himself. Second thing, Frank continued, his voice taking on the calm, authoritative tone he'd once used to brief Marines before dangerous missions. We figure out exactly what we're dealing with and what our options are. We don't panic, we don't waste energy on things we can't control, and we use our heads. He began exploring their chamber with the methodical precision of someone who'd mapped hostile territory under combat conditions. The cathedral room was about 20 feet wide by 30 feet long, with a ceiling that varied from 8 feet at the lowest point to 15 feet at the natural dome in the center. The fallen rocks had created new contours and dangerous unstable piles, but they'd also revealed some previously hidden features. There were 3 passages leading out of the cathedral room. The main one they'd entered through was now completely blocked by the rockfall, tons of limestone that would require heavy machinery to move safely. Of the other 2 passages, one led to what appeared to be a very narrow squeeze that even the children would have difficulty navigating, and it showed no signs of air movement that would indicate a connection to the surface. But the 3rd passage, Frank aimed his flashlight down a sloping tunnel that he hadn't noticed during their initial tour. Cool air moved through it, not the still, dead air of a sealed cave system, but a slight but definite breeze that meant this passage connected to something larger. Possibly even to the surface, though he'd been in enough cave systems to know that such connections could be dozens of miles away through impassable terrain. "Mr. Martinez," Tyler asked, his voice trying to sound casual but failing to hide the underlying fear, "are the rescue people coming for us?" Frank knelt down to Tyler's level, making eye contact in the way that military leaders learn to do when delivering difficult but necessary truths to their men. "Son, I absolutely guarantee you that there are dozens of people working right now to get us out of here. Some of the best rescue specialists in the state are probably already on their way. But while they're working from their side of this problem, we're going to work from ours. We're not going to sit here waiting to be rescued. We're going to rescue ourselves." He didn't tell them that the breeze from the 3rd passage could lead to an even more dangerous cave-in zone, or that the sound of trickling water meant possible underground flooding that could trap them in rising water with nowhere to go. He didn't explain that their air supply was limited in what had become a mostly sealed chamber, or that the aftershocks he could feel through the rock meant the cave system was still unstable. Instead, he began teaching them what survival really meant. Not just staying alive, but maintaining hope, working as a team, and never giving up. Hour 1. Frank organized their supplies with military precision and established a base of operations in the safest corner of the chamber, away from any ceiling areas that showed cracks or loose rock. He showed them how to conserve their flashlight batteries by using only one light at a time, and he began telling them stories, not just any stories, but carefully chosen tales of people who had survived impossible situations through courage, intelligence, and teamwork. Hour 6. The children were getting hungry, and the psychological impact of their situation was beginning to set in. Frank shared his emergency rations, high-energy bars he always carried out of old military habit, and organized the first expedition into the mystery passage. Moving in single file with Frank leading, they began exploring the sloping tunnel that followed that promising breeze, marking their route with small piles of stones so they could find their way back. Hour 12. The passage led them through a series of connected chambers, each one different from the last. Some were narrow crawlways that required them to move on hands and knees. Others opened into vast spaces that their flashlight beams couldn't fully illuminate. Always, though, they followed that faint current of moving air, Frank's military navigation training helping him maintain their direction and remember their route. Hour 18. They found the source of the breeze, a narrow opening high in the wall of a chamber that stretched up into darkness beyond their lights. The opening was perhaps 18 inches wide and positioned about 20 feet up a sheer rock face that would challenge an experienced rock climber, let alone children and an aging man with arthritis. But the airflow was strong, and Frank could swear he detected the faintest hint of outside air, the smell of trees and sky, rather than the mineral scent of deep caves. Hour 24. The first night was the hardest test of Frank's leadership abilities. Sophia cried for her mother, quiet sobs that broke everyone's hearts. Marcus worried aloud that they would run out of air or be forgotten by the rescue teams. Emma kept asking if the rescuers had found them yet, and her disappointment grew with each "not yet" answer. Tyler tried to maintain his brave front, but kept asking Frank technical questions about cave-ins and survival that revealed his growing fear. Frank stayed awake all night, keeping watch over his small charges, conserving their remaining battery power, and planning. That's when he made the decision that would define the next 2 days. A decision that drew on every skill he'd learned in 3 decades of military service, every principle of leadership he'd mastered under fire, and every promise he'd ever made about never leaving anyone behind. Hour 30, Frank began what he privately called Operation Homecoming. Using techniques he'd learned in survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, CR training decades ago, he started building the tools they would need. Rope fashioned from torn strips of clothing, backpack straps, and shoelaces, twisted together using a technique he'd learned from Special Forces instructors. Handholds chipped into the rock face using a multi-tool he carried, not the fancy camping gear that modern outdoorsmen use, but a simple, sturdy tool that had been with him since Vietnam. A primitive but functional pulley system created from zippers, carabiners from the children's school backpacks, and metal fittings salvaged from the damaged safety railings. But most importantly, Frank began training his 5 young soldiers in the skills they would need to survive and escape. Emma, he said, assigning roles with the same care he'd once used to organize combat patrols, "You're my navigator. You have the best memory, and you pay attention to details. I need you to memorize every passage we take, every turn we make, every landmark we pass. If we get separated, or if I can't lead for any reason, you'll be the one who can guide everyone back to safety." "Marcus," Frank continued, "you're my engineer. You understand how things work, and you think through problems logically. Help me figure out how to make these rope systems strong enough to hold our weight, and help me test every handheld before we trust our lives to it." "Sarah, you're my communications and supply specialist. You're organized and careful with details. Keep track of our food and water, ration everything fairly, and help me figure out how to make our flashlights last as long as possible." "Tyler, you're my reconnaissance specialist. You're athletic, and you're not afraid to try new things. Your job is to test each path we consider, to squeeze through tight spaces I can't fit through, and to tell me honestly what you find, even if it's bad news." "And Sophia," Frank said, kneeling down to look the youngest member of their team in the eyes, "you're my inspiration and my motivation. When things get really hard, when I start to doubt we can do this, your courage and your smile remind me why we never, ever give up. Every step we take for you and for everyone else who's counting on us." Hour 36. The breakthrough came when Tyler, small and athletic enough to squeeze through a gap that Frank's adult frame couldn't navigate, discovered that the high opening didn't just lead upward toward the surface. Instead, it connected to an extensive network of passages that ran parallel to their trapped location, forming what cavers call a maze cave, a complex 3-dimensional puzzle of interconnected tunnels, chambers, and shafts. Hour 42. Frank had rigged a rope and pulley system that would have impressed professional rescue teams. Using techniques learned from military rappelling and improvised rope work, he'd created a method to lift each child up the 20-foot sheer rock face to reach the opening Tyler had discovered. His arthritic hands were raw and bleeding from handling rough rope and chipping handholds in stone, but he never let the children see his pain or doubt. Hour 48. One by one, Frank hauled each child up to the high opening, then used a complex rope system to lower himself down and repeat the process in the next chamber. They were moving through passages that no human had probably ever seen, following air currents and Frank's decades-old training in underground navigation. The children, exhausted and scared but trusting their guide completely, followed him through a labyrinth that would have challenged experienced cavers with professional equipment. Hour 54. They encountered their first serious obstacle, a chamber that had partially flooded due to the earthquake's disruption of underground streams. The water was cold, waist-deep on Frank and chest-deep on the children, and there was no way to know what lay beneath the murky surface. But Frank's military experience included river crossings under hostile conditions, and he guided them across using techniques that kept everyone safe despite the treacherous conditions. Hour 60. Frank heard it first, the distant sound of machinery echoing through the rock. Heavy equipment working somewhere above them, the rhythmic pounding of pneumatic drills, the rumble of diesel engines. They were close, so close to the rescue operation that was undoubtedly working around the clock to reach them from the blocked main entrance. Hour 66. They faced a choice between two passages, one that led toward the sounds of rescue activity, but required navigating an unstable area where recent rockfalls were evident, and another that led away from the sounds but followed stronger air currents that suggested a more direct route to the surface. Frank made the decision to follow the air currents, trusting his survival training over his desire to reach the rescue teams. Hour 70. Frank found what he'd been looking for, a crevice between rocks that led upward toward natural light. The gap was narrow, barely wide enough for the children, and it required climbing skills that pushed everyone to their limits. But there, impossibly bright after 3 days underground, was genuine daylight filtering down from above. Hour 72. The gap led to a surface opening nearly 200 yards from the cave entrance, in a rocky area that the rescue teams hadn't yet searched because it seemed geologically unrelated to the main cave system. One by one, Frank boosted each child up through the narrow opening, his muscles screaming from exhaustion, but his determination unshakable. Emma went first, blinking in the afternoon sunlight and immediately shouting for help. Then, Marcus, who immediately began explaining to the first rescue worker who reached them exactly how they'd escaped and where Frank was. Then Sarah, crying with relief and asking if her parents were there. Then Tyler, who maintained his composure until he saw his father running toward them, then broke down completely. Finally, little Sophia, who looked back down at Frank with concern, even as rescuers were lifting her to safety. "Mr. Martinez," Sophia called back down to him, her voice echoing in the narrow passage. "What about you? You have to come too." Frank smiled in the darkness, exhaustion and pain and relief all mixing together in his weathered face. "I'll find another way, sweetheart. You tell everyone I'm coming. And Sophia, you tell them that you all were the bravest soldiers I ever served with." But Frank knew the truth, that he couldn't tell a 10-year-old girl. The gap was too narrow for his adult frame, and he was too exhausted from 3 days of continuous exertion to search for another route. His arthritic joints had given everything they had and more. His ribs, possibly cracked from the initial rockfall, made every breath painful. His raw and bleeding hands could barely grip the rope any longer. He had done what he came to do. He had brought them home. The mission was complete, and in military terms, that was what mattered. Whether he made it out himself was secondary to the success of the primary objective. Above ground, the scene erupted in chaos and joy as 5 children emerged from a crack in the rock that none of the professional rescue teams had even identified as connected to the cave system. Parents screamed and ran toward their children. Rescue workers cheered and embraced each other. And the news crews that had been covering the tragic cave-in suddenly had the miracle story of the decade. Emergency Chief Hayes stared in absolute disbelief as the children pointed back toward the gap and tried to explain their incredible journey through passages that didn't appear on any cave survey map. "Mr. Martinez is still down there," Emma told him through tears of exhaustion and relief. "He saved us. He saved all of us. He carried us and lifted us and never gave up, not even for 1 minute." For the first time in 72 hours, Chief Hayes allowed himself to smile, not just with professional satisfaction, but with genuine amazement and respect. He grabbed his radio and called the command post. "All units, this is Hayes. We have all 5 children safe and uninjured, and we've got one hell of a hero to extract from that cave system. I need our best technical rescue team at these coordinates immediately. It took another 8 hours and the most sophisticated cave rescue equipment in the state to widen the gap enough for Frank to emerge. The rescue required hydraulic spreading tools, specialized climbing gear, and a team of expert cavers working in shifts. When Frank finally crawled out into the evening sunlight, supported by rescue workers and barely conscious from exhaustion, he was met by something he'd never expected in his 68 years of life. A crowd of several hundred people applauding as if he were a returning war hero. But Frank only had eyes for 5 faces in that crowd. 5 children who broke away from their parents and rescue workers and ran to him despite the paramedics' protests. 5 young lives who hugged him like he'd given them the world itself, which in a way, he had. Later, after the paramedics had treated his injuries and the reporters had asked their questions, when Frank was finally alone in his hospital room, he found a note tucked into the pocket of his jacket. It was written in crayon on a piece of paper torn from Marcus's geology notebook. Dear Mr. Martinez, you are the best soldier ever, and we will never forget you. Thank you for bringing us home. Love, your team. Emma, Marcus, Sarah, Tyler, and Sophia. Frank folded the note carefully and placed it next to his Purple Heart in the drawer that held his other military decorations. For the first time in decades, he felt like those medals meant something again. When the news crews asked Frank how he'd managed what professional rescuers called an impossible extraction, he gave them the same answer he'd given to military reporters decades earlier. I just did what anyone would do. But Emergency Chief Hayes, who'd spent 25 years in rescue operations and had seen every kind of disaster response, knew better. What Frank Martinez did in that cave, he told reporters, required technical expertise that takes decades to learn, physical courage that can't be taught, leadership skills that are forged only under the worst conditions, and a kind of love that most people never discover in themselves. Frank never did tell them about the Silver Star, about the 3 tours of duty, about the countless missions where leaving someone behind wasn't an option. He just went home to his quiet house on Pine Street, where 5 families now brought him dinner every week, where 5 children visited every day after school, and where an entire community had learned the difference between an ordinary person and a genuine hero. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never stop serving, even when no one's watching, even when they're no longer in uniform, even when the battle is fought in darkness with children's lives hanging in the balance. And sometimes it takes 72 hours in the Earth's depths to show the world what real courage looks like when it's tested by impossible odds and fueled by unbreakable love. In our darkest moments, courage still finds a way, often in the quietest places where ordinary people reveal themselves to be extraordinary. Not everyone who serves wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone made it home safely. Subscribe to Grateful Stories, where honor is remembered, kindness is celebrated, and no act of quiet heroism is ever forgotten.